Good day, everyone. Let me welcome you all to Restorative Cities. I'm Valerie Fletcher. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Human-Centered Design. And we have people coming in from around the world, which I'm thrilled to see, always thrilled to see. And I want to welcome Layla McKay, Dr. Layla McKay, and Jenny Rowe. I have been addicted to this book since it came out, before I had the chance to meet either of the authors. I've been following Layla's work on a nonprofit around urban design and mental health in the UK for a long time, since it started. So this is a great pleasure to have the opportunity to share my excitement about the work you're doing with our audience. And I want to just briefly describe these extraordinarily accomplished women. Layla is a psychiatrist, and she is a director of the Center for Urban Design and Mental Health, and a zealot out there in the world. She's an extraordinarily busy woman who is on a campaign to get people to think differently about the design of cities. And we are equally thrilled to have Jenny Rowe. And we're fortunate to have Jenny Rowe in the United States at the University of Virginia School of Architecture. Jenny is an environmental psychologist, and she is the director of the Center for Design and Health there. And I want to also welcome two panelists who will join us after Layla and Jenny have had an opportunity to share their story and their book with you. And those are Hannah Wang, who is a graduate student in architecture at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and Vesper Moore, who is Chief Operating Officer at Kiva, an extraordinary Massachusetts-based organization that is famous for its advocacy for people with mental health experience. We are thrilled to have them. They will be part of this. As I think many of you who know IHCD know, we always like to have people with lived experience engaged in all of our presentations because they enrich the experience for all of us. And I want to just end with a reminder that I think all of us are so aware of the need for health and well-being, mental health and well-being, because COVID has been such a traumatic experience for the world, and certainly for each of us, probably in ways we don't even fully understand. And I think one of the things that we've all gotten much more attentive to is the aspiration for well-being, even for happiness. And I think recent research has been telling us quite clearly that you cannot figure out well-being and happiness alone, that this is inevitably a relational aspiration. And I think that's part of why this is such a critical conversation. Cities are the places where people come together, and we need to be thinking about not only our ability to connect with one another, as enhanced by restorative cities, but also our ability to truly live the diversity that we so talk about and so aspire to, that it is best done in cities. So I will now turn it over to our wonderful presenters. Very excited to have you. Please take it away, Layla and Jenny.
Thank you so much, Valerie, and it is a pleasure to see you all here today. I'm going to kick off, and then Jenny will take over, and we're just going to talk to you for a little while about some of the interesting ideas around restorative cities. And you know, when you think about cities, they really are bastions of opportunity, aren't they? In public health, we often talk about the urban advantage, so the benefits to people of living in cities: more jobs, more access to cultural and recreational opportunities, people to meet, and just essentially all the cultural and academic and employment and economic opportunities that exist in cities. But at the same time, we know that cities can also cause challenges for our mental health, and lots of those are linked to environmental stressors that can exacerbate all sorts of mental health problems. Thinking about things like noise, pollution, overcrowding, crime, loneliness. Research keeps on telling us that the rates of serious mental health problems, things like schizophrenia, depression, are much higher in cities than they are in rural contexts. But it's not quite so straightforward. For example, there's some new research that tells us that bigger cities may be better for our mental health than smaller ones because they may promote more opportunity for social interaction. There's all sorts of interesting ways in which cities can interact with mental health. And those questions of what led Jenny and myself to ask, how are cities good and bad for our mental health and well-being? And what can we do through urban design to take advantage of that? What's the role for urban design in mental health and well-being? And it's an important question. We know at the moment there are rising rates of mental health problems around the world. And I think the pandemic has really focused people's attention on how physical environments affect us, both physically and mentally, which means that this moment is an incredibly timely opportunity to be having this conversation. It is an exciting and very fast-moving emerging field. So Jenny and I will first of all start by telling you about the Restorative Cities framework that we've developed through looking at all sorts of research and case studies and learned experience. And then we'll welcome in the panelists who will give you some insights on how they're interpreting the framework for urban design for mental health and well-being. But before we dive on in, I think it's probably helpful to make sure we're all on the same page. We're talking here about urban design for mental health. So the question is, what exactly is mental health? Well, according to the World Health Organization, mental health is a state where a person realizes their potential. They can cope with the normal stresses of life. They can work productively and fruitfully, and they're able to make a contribution to their community. Now, people who have mental disorders usually experience some combination of problems with their thoughts, emotions, behaviors, and relationships with other people. And these symptoms can cause all sorts of distress, can impair people's personal functioning, and essentially affect the way to which they're able to meet that definition of mental health. And I'm sure that you're all very familiar with various types of mental disorders, things like depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, dementia, ADHD, schizophrenia. But promoting mental health and supporting people who've got mental disorders isn't just about medication or therapy. Obviously, having good access to mental health care is absolutely essential. But frustratingly, over the past 30 years, there hasn't been much in the way of breakthroughs in psychiatry. So that's what makes Restorative Cities really exciting. It gives us this opportunity to look at a wider public health approach for mental health and innovations in the built environment that could offer some solutions. So far, I think we're all aware that urban design strategies for healthy cities have been very much driven by physical health. So focusing on how do you reduce the risk of chronic health conditions like obesity, by focusing on active travel, or how to reduce breathing problems by improving air quality. What there hasn't been is a drive towards looking at how can you design cities in ways to support mental health and well-being. And that was the inspiration for writing this book. So let me tell you a bit about it. You can go into the Restorative Cities framework. So Restorative Cities is a new concept, but it brings together lots of existing concepts into this new framework that really places mental health, wellness, and quality of life at the forefront of city design and planning. We have 7 pillars or components that are illustrated here and set out in all sorts of detail in the book. And there is a lot of detail, of course, because this is an evidence-based book building off lots of scientific evidence, thousands of studies in restorative environment research. And what makes that challenging to achieve is that it comes from psychiatry and geography, architecture, design, planning, what else, public health, engineering, all sorts of different disciplines that need to be brought together so that we can really understand how certain settings can work to foster recovery from mental fatigue, to support people with depression and stress and anxiety and enable recovery. And, you know, how can planners and designers use that knowledge to actually design cities that better support mental health and well-being? It's a really interesting question, and one that we seek to find the answer to. And so we're going to take you through the attributes. I refer to them as pillars or attributes, or feel free to pick your terminology. But the first of the attributes is probably one of the most well-known. It's certainly the most robustly evidenced restorative attribute of city design. Is exposure to the natural environments, otherwise known as the green city. So the research shows us the green space can reduce depression and anxiety. It can improve brain function. It can help manage the symptom severity of anxiety disorders or schizophrenia, ADHD, dementia. Plus, it has other advantages like helping to reduce heat stress and improving sleep quality that is incredibly important for mental health. Now, the impact of green space on mental health is not just uniform. It's modified by the amount, the accessibility, the type, whether there's views of nature, whether you're immersed in nature, the perceived quality and biodiversity, how it's used, and of course, the amount of exposure, sometimes people refer to it as the dose of nature, that people receive in the course of their daily lives. Now, COVID-19 has obviously shed light on inequalities in people's access to and experiences of green space. Certainly, we saw that with people who were sitting in their gardens and people who lived far from a park. We definitely need more investment in poorer communities and improved access for children, young people, older people, the particular sections of society that particularly benefit and may have challenges in accessing green space. The next slide is an extract from the Green City chapter in the book. Each chapter essentially has the same format. It sets out the mechanisms by which a restorative attribute delivers its benefits, and then describes the evidence for mental health benefits and design guidelines that are both at a neighbourhood scale and a city scale. It's not a rule book. It's not saying you must do this and this effect will be delivered. It's essentially providing helpful guidelines that can be interpreted flexibly based on the settings and cultures in which you're working. I'm going to pass over to Jenny now to take you through the rest of the attributes. Over to you, Jenny.
Well, thank you, Layla, and thank you also, Valerie, for the introduction. I would just add that I'm a researcher, so the work you see on this slide, the benefits of green cities for mental health, I have many studies that show collectively many of these benefits. And if you've got specific interests, let's say in stress regulation, then please do reach out and I can share that work with you. I'm going to move on to the blue city. If I can get this to work, there we go. This is Sheffield in the UK, where I took students from UVA last year to look at a city that's really reinventing itself through the insertion of green and blue infrastructure. Sheffield is a bit like Pittsburgh. It was a city of steel that went into decline. And this is what greets you when you come out of the station at Sheffield, this fantastic fountain, which is a reference to the steel industry in Sheffield. Now, water is possibly the most restorative attributes of any that we mention in the book. Contact with urban water, be it hard engineered water like this or soft, access to water, so pond edges, lake edges. The evidence is much the same as it is for the green city, i.e. there's a reduced risk of depression with access to water. It improves our stress alleviation, it improves our mood, it reduces depression, but the evidence isn't quite so great as for that green city. So what is it that is so special about water? Well, it's an increased opportunity for interaction, for fascination and wonder, and I'll come back to the attribution of fascination in a little while. is the opportunity to touch and play with water, to see it change its form as it flows over different surface textures, to see how it interacts with light. It's a truly dynamic attribute in the environment, and this is what makes it more restorative. Leila touched upon inequalities in access to green space. The same is true in terms of access to urban water. Critical in terms of that access is maintaining its quality. How many of us recognize stagnant bodies of water in our city that are unattractive? They may smell, they may be dirty. So equitable and safe access to blue space is one of our critical attributes in our framework. On to our third attribute in this framework, which is the sensory city. So scientific evidence is now demonstrating how our senses can be harnessed within urban design to exert positive impacts on our mental health. Now, some of these attributes we include and talk about in the book include reducing unpleasant noise and designing positive soundscapes, sonic refuges, for example, in the form of bird sound, kinetic sound, the sound of sculpture as it whizzes through as the air picks up and whizzes through a sculpture, increasing opportunities for access to healthy food and positive food auras, smells that harness feelings of place identity and belongingness. And also, Leila and I have posited that increasing visual complexity may hold one key to reducing depression and suicide rates. This slide here shows a proposed interactive lighting design for a bridge in Londonderry, Northern Ireland. It's a bridge where there is a high rate of suicide currently. Now, the plan is that the lights can be manipulated using your smartphone. So I don't know whether you can see, but the bridge has a proposal for these sheaves of lights, and you can change the color of those through interacting with this exhibit through your phone. Now, we again have posited that this increases cognitive engagement, it causes an aesthetic distraction, and it could significantly reduce suicide. Time will tell. This is in the process of being installed at the moment in Northern Ireland. On to the neighbourly city. This is Hong Kong, where Leila was based for several years. The neighbourly city really addresses how we use urban design to build strong social networks. We know how important those networks are to mental health. Loneliness has been called the new smoking, that your likelihood of death from loneliness is as high or equal to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So how we design our cities that foster opportunities for both impromptu and organized social interaction is critical to our mental health. In the book, we talk about the notion of bumping places, the places where we can have these impromptu encounters at the market, at the coffee shop, the dog park. We all know how critical those encounters were during COVID-19, particularly for those people who lived on their own. And there are attributes of a neighborhood that really help foster that type of bumping interaction, and they include what we call in the book fine grain shop fronts. I had to explain to an architect the other day what this meant, and really they are shop fronts that have inherently curious and fascinating facades. A great place to see this, I think, is Copenhagen, where they really, in their basements, they have these extraordinary activities and shop front designs taking place. Housing, it's fairly obvious to say, needs to be designed to promote social interactions and networks across all ages. We'll come on to an example of that in a moment in Barcelona. Parks, community gardens, there's evidence to show that access to green space in our city is really helping facilitate social interaction. It's facilitating a sense of belonging and altruism and increased sense of trust in a neighborhood, all things that are super important in our polarized world in which really we need more altruism and more coming together. So really interesting research there. All right, I'll move on to the active city. Now this is Barcelona, where they have taken on board a number of ideas that we talk about in the book framework. Now, the active city is a city that integrates physical activity into your everyday urban life and enables mobility, be it walking, cycling, skating, for all citizens. And the physical health benefits are very interrelated to our mental and social and cognitive well-being. And so I do think the US and other parts of the world have made real strides in designing cities for active living. And some of those benefits have stuck since COVID. So New York, for instance, Chicago have closed major roadways to allow for more active living. But the focus has been more on the physical activity benefits and less on those mental and social benefits. And that's one thing that Leah and I are trying to do with the book, is bring those benefits and leverage those benefits kind of higher up the chain, so to speak. So the benefits of being active, I probably don't need to tell you this, but they include a reduced risk of depression and anxiety, improved stress regulation, and improved brain health and memory functioning, which is really significant or plays a significant role in healthy aging and healthy child development. So here is the Barcelona Superblock. It's a mixed use community. It's what we call multimodal. It includes those comfortable streets for active living. Traffic is reduced and calmed. The streets connect well together. There's subsidized and integrated public transit in the system. And there's a huge scope for play, street trees and urban greening, and opportunities to come together around picnic tables and eat and converse together. So we're on to the 6th attributes, which we have called the playable city. The benefits of play for child well-being and development are really fairly well known and well evidenced. So play fosters physical, social, cognitive, and emotional development in children. But we argue in the book for an all-age approach to play in the city. So urban design can nurture creativity, learning, self-identity, and social interaction across all ages in a playful capacity. Our need for play does not stop when we hit our teens. And it offers a continued developmental opportunity for adolescents, but also for us as adults. And in the book, we distinguish between two types of play contexts. What we call pure play context, the props and context designed specifically for play. We see this everywhere in our cities, playgrounds, and we're beginning to see more play streets, particularly in Europe, I would say. So the top image there is of a net. It's a city in the Netherlands, and that's what we would probably call a pure play context. And then there are other playable contexts, not designed for play, but which are appropriated for playful activities. For instance, there you see somebody walking a trapeze. This is the meadows in Edinburgh, where I live, where I am not in Virginia. So these types of activities, play appropriation, parkour, free running, people use the attributes of the city in a very creative way. We also talk in the book about interactive art exhibits. So here is an image of Chicago as seen from the cloud, or some people call it the bean, Amish Kapoor's sculpture in the heart of Chicago. And what happens when you interact with that exhibit is you see yourself in a very playful way, interacting with the city in a very different type of capacity from how you would normally interact with that city. And Chicago generally does a really good job downtown. There's a wealth of opportunities for playing with the city in novel and innovative ways. And then finally, the final image there is of two young women interacting with the city through their phone again, through playing a game. We call them urban health games, in which they are, I'm not quite sure what they're doing, but they are tracking their activity. They're also monitoring their steps and their pulse and some of their heart rate variability as they move through the city. So they're getting this kind of feedback both on the city and its exhibits and its attributes, but also on their health. And then finally, the final attribute in our model, in arguably the most important, is the inclusive city. Now, we interpret inclusive design as design for all ages, all genders, all races and ethnicities, all sexual orientations, all socioeconomic strata, and for the full diversity of physical, sensory, and cognitive abilities and needs. Unfortunately, we also know that urban design has contributed to segregation, exclusion, prejudice in our cities. It affects people's self-esteem, their dignity, their independence, and their mental health, as well as their ability to access a full range of a city's educational, economic, social, cultural, and health opportunities. So some ways in the book in which we argue that cities can achieve more inclusivity is through attracting people to mixed income, mixed age neighborhoods, as they are offering in Barcelona in the super block, by offering good quality housing and associated facilities. Housing on its own it is no use without adjacent facilities to education, to culture, to activities and recreational opportunities. And really, by making urban design decisions that recognize the needs and characteristics of all residents. So in this particular chapter on inclusive cities, we do focus on the need for co-creation and participatory design processes. And finally, the why really. Why is it that some attributes of our cities have a better benefit to mental health than others? Now, Layla mentioned earlier that the book is grounded in evidence, and that's a key part of the book. A second key part of the book is that it's grounded in restorative environment theory. And what this theory postulates is that there are 4 psychological processes, again, backed up by thousands of studies. There are 4 psychological processes that really contribute to our restorative health, to our mental and our social well-being. And the first of these is fascination. I mentioned earlier that water has this particular component of fascination. It's a dynamic quality. It's a quality that causes us to engage, to be curious, or even every day, or in the terms of kind of just fractal patterns of leaves, is one of the benefits and one of the processes associated with restorative health. The other main benefit, I would say, the main process, is this sense of being away and of extent. And they're similar but slightly different. So being away is that sense of getting away from your everyday world. You don't necessarily need to step into that world. You can access that world by looking at an image, or looking out your window, or even plugging into, let's say, a piece of music that can also have a very restorative effect on your mental well-being. So being away is just taking time out from your everyday, and a world that draws you out of that everyday. And extent is slightly different. Extent is a world that offers you a kind of connection to another place. And typically that might include having a view up and out and across the city. There's this image here is from, I think it's Medellin in Colombia, where you get that view up and out of the city. Extent has also been interpreted as legibility and coherence in your environment, a sense of being able to move and get around relatively easily. And that brings me on to the other attribute in this model, which is compatibility. It makes sense that our world has to have a good fit with our particular needs, and it needs to be inclusive in terms of meeting those needs. And that concludes our introduction to the book. Now, here are our contact details. We have now a panel discussion. I'm going to hand it back to Valerie to oversee that panel discussion. And I'm going to stop sharing the screen now, unless you want me to keep this slide up. Perhaps somebody could advise what they'd like me to do.
Jenny, this is PJ. Why don't you, if you and Layla could perhaps enter your contact information into the chat. That would allow everyone who wants to reach out to you to do so directly.
Will do.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is thrilling, a million ideas. And we have questions starting to come in. We also have a wonderfully diverse audience from places as varied as the UK and Spain and Argentina and one of my favorite cities in the world, Mexico City, which is, I hope we hear from the participant from there. So before we begin, and I want to bring in Vesper and Hannah, as a person who speaks every hour of every day and has for the last 25 years about inclusive design as a framework for thinking about design that anticipates the ordinariness of human diversity. I know that one of the big challenges, which is nicely captured also by one of our first questioners, Abby Schneider, asking, I'm curious how to get buy-in from key decision makers, elected officials, designers, even I would add, to make sure that these investments happen and are executed in a meaningful way. What's the trick? Before we turn it over and expand to our additional panelists, what has been your experience? I mean, I think we all have cities around the world where we see certain things that work very well. Chicago has some, Barcelona has others. And I think it's just worth giving you a minute to talk about this issue of you are peddlers of a framework that you believe in deeply, as are we. And how do you actually get conversion experiences from the people who really need to own these ideas?
I guess I'll kick off and then Jenny, you can come in. I don't think that there's any one trick to this, of course, but really I think that the key is figuring out what the developer or what the city strategy writer or what the city leader what they can benefit, what are their incentives to deliver on this, to invest in urban design for mental health. So in some cases, it's about making a financial case for why this is beneficial. For some cases, it's, it may be the case that you can market developments in certain ways that that will make benefits to mental health a selling point. In other ways, it's things like influencing cities to develop strategies that really do want to focus on mental health for the benefit of that city, for the benefit of the inhabitants, getting public health involved, getting the various built environment specialists involved, and really coming together to find a common language that says, gosh, this is going to be, it's not just a thing to do that's going to be more expensive, it's going to be more of a hassle. Actually, here is the case for why it's going to benefit the city. Here's the case why it's going to benefit you. And then we've heard over the years that it's not been possible to do this because there hasn't been enough evidence. The evidence is now here. It's in this book. Get on with it. Jenny, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I do think for people who govern our cities, both from a public health perspective and a planning perspective, they are super busy leaders. They don't have the time do what Layla and I did. And so I can put an image like this, the benefits of green cities, in front of, let's say, Maurice Cox, who's the commissioner and leader of planning in Chicago. And I can say to him, this is really convincing, Maurice, you've got a plan for planting trees, but did you know that planting trees could actually bring down the levels of depression in your city? Now, he doesn't know that. So getting the information out in an accessible format and then really working to communicate that to people who govern and make these decisions. And I would just add to Layla's point about cost benefit analysis. My research has been involved in that, but it requires funding, it requires longitudinal studies to develop and advance that cost benefit analysis, but it really needs to happen. So the evidence is here, it's pretty thick, it's pretty substantive, but there's still more work that needs to be done.
Thank you, both Layla and Jenny. I think part of what we believe is also important is for people to recognize that design matters. That so often this conversation happens without understanding the role of design, and particularly the role of design in our brains. And I think that's still a frontier area for a lot of people. They don't realize how powerful it is. So we are now going to bring in Hannah and Vesper. Welcome. Can you unmute yourselves? So here's a couple of people who likely have ideas that they would like to interject as we begin this conversation and before we actually go to our list. So Vesper and Hannah, please, the floor is yours.
Absolutely. I mean, I first want to say it's a really, really excellent design to include green space, to have sensory considerations for neurodivergent people and people of varying experiences. I do want to say, as someone in my own life who's grown up in a city in Section 8 housing, which you consider housing for lower income people, particularly lower income Hispanic and Indigenous and Black people. A lot of what I've done in my work in terms of mental health advocacy and disability rights has been preventing, to whatever extent possible, hostile architecture. So like the first thing that I think of when I think about this means of thinking of restorative cities and these accessible designs is, can someone sit there for a long period of time? Is there enough room for someone to be in that space? You know, as well as does it allow for younger people, older communities as well, to be able to gather in groups? And what I mean by this, a good example of this is, for example, a bench that has an armrest in the middle so someone can't relax. Or if you're familiar with subway trains, having a bench with multiple kind of rests in the middle where it could be hard for someone to sit down for a long period of time. Another example is windows with slopes along the side so you can't sit around them, and other park structures that we see. So for me, from an advocacy standpoint, when I think about a lot of these communities, it's a challenge. And understandably, you know, people are concerned about property value. They're concerned about safety of community. Are people accessing the resources that they need? But at the same time, how do we ensure comfortable and accessible space as much as possible is the thing that arises for me. You know, I'm gonna ask that as a question, just everyone on the panel to think more about as well, because I'm thinking about it.
Thank you, Vesper. Hannah, any thoughts?
Yes. Hi, thank you, Layla and Jenny, for a wonderful lecture. The first thing that comes to mind for me when thinking, especially about buy-in from designers and officials, as someone who has worked in educating designers around accessibility and inclusivity, is the idea that people want to do the right thing. They just need the tools to be able to do so. And I think one of the things that's so powerful about the book is that it has very practical, tangible ways in which designers can incorporate these practices into their designs and into their daily work. And I think the other thing that's very important that Vesper briefly touched on is the idea that all people, and especially disabled people, deserve beautiful things. And I think that's a radical idea that even though it sounds quite simple, is something that maybe has not been quite considered in the design of inclusivity and what that looks like. And so I want to challenge everyone who's attending this lecture today, similarly, to think about what does it look like to provide beauty and kind of care simultaneously, to activate that fascination and that wonder that Layla and Jenny have so eloquently spoken about, and how that can impact all communities, and especially those who are marginalized.
Thank you, Hannah. Actually, in thinking about that, I want to actually bring in a comment from one of our guests, Paloma Huesca, who works as an access consultant for David Bonnet Associates in London. I trust that perhaps Jenny and Layla know David's firm. Do you know David Bonnet? David is one of the great leaders in inclusive design in London. And Paloma is asking, something I found fascinating working mostly on accessibility is how well the circle, your circle from the book, works with environments, become more inclusive, the more diverse the people who use them, we become more aware of other people's experiences, leading to a more inclusive city. The more we bump up against each other, the more aware we are of the benefits of design that works for everyone. And I think, I think we see that every day. And I think we're always fighting against trends that push us in the other direction. Any thoughts on that? I mean, we do find that in the United States, where diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility is very much the byword of every institution and every government agency, really thinking about how to make it meaningful is still something that, I think is going to take a whole lot of rolling up our sleeves and working together and figuring it out in fresh ways. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I do want to also just say gratitude for accessibility is something that's often expected. And when accessibility should be the bare minimum, right, in a lot of these cities. And often the considerations for what is accessible can be thought of in the context of physical disability, but not often psychosocial disability and other forms of disability. So what I also appreciate here that I want to say is that the sensory considerations are a big part of it. But also another piece is the presence of positive messages does not have a great impact when there is an overwhelming presence of negative messages. So for example, you cannot stand here for more than 15 minutes will overshadow another sign that says, have a great day. Those are important considerations, especially when you think of disabled people who come out of service systems and they might be used to signs that say flight risk or other types of signs. So positive messaging and negative messaging, I would also say, can be an important part of this.
Thank you. Layla, Jenny?
Yeah, I mean, I think that probably the overarching message of the book that really speaks to many of those comments is the part found in the chapter called The Inclusive City. And obviously that chapter includes all sorts of ideas about how to deliver a more inclusive city. But really for me, I think a really important factor is inclusion in development, design and management of whatever that part of the city is. There's lots of interesting musings upon what constitutes meaningful engagement of diverse users of a city, and really, handing out a survey doesn't really cut it. And what are the ways in which people can be really meaningfully engaged, and that their ideas and feedback and experiences can be properly incorporated. And I think that what we found in researching this book is that investment in that part of the process can really pay dividends, and just paying lip service to the concept of, oh yeah, we consulted some people, doesn't deliver that inclusive result that you're really looking for. But yeah, I mean, it's complex, it takes time, it takes effort, it can take money. But what's interesting, of course, is that not only does high quality engagement of potential future users mean that you're likely to achieve a better result, actually the very act of doing the engaging does in itself have mental health benefits when these people are feeling empowered to have an impact in their city and to have engagement with their neighbours and others. So it's a really interesting and challenging area, but people could be investing more to get it right. Jenny?
So just to echo that point, that it is a really challenging area, and it's so complex. So I'm just beginning to now dig into my research around spatial processing across people on the neurodiverse spectrum, and how different that is. And this idea of fascination, and Hannah, you touched upon it, you know, what I am fascinated in and find curious and awesome may be very different from somebody's who has, let's say, autism, and their experience of fascination and what they are able to manage in terms of sensory processing. So, you know, there's a lot we need to do in terms of understanding that psychology of experience from different lenses. And we need a lot more research and a lot of neuroscientists and smart cognitive and developmental psychologists to embrace this area of research. To find out more about those different experiences. So just echoing the fact that it's complex.
If I might just make note that we at IHCD do extensive work in a form of contextual inquiry, which engages people with lived experience of functional limitation, physical, sensory, and brain-based directly in environments. They're real people in real environments. And Hannah is actually one of those people, and her variety of experiences has been invaluable to us on extraordinarily diverse projects. So Hannah also has low vision, and she is building very big muscles on really catching things that make a difference, relative to brain function and relative to sight. But it is the acquisition of that information directly from users that provides critical data that we don't have enough of. And in many cases, that's specific to a place. And we're now challenged to figure out how much of it can we actually extract and build towards some generalizations. So just wanted to put that in and acknowledge that Hannah has extensive experience as what we call a user expert. Let's go to some of our guests. Carter Goodell is a guest asking about the Blue City section. Is there an indication that initiatives bringing water features into public spaces are contributing to advancing legislation/action regarding clean water on a major scale?
I'm happy to take that one as a researcher on the benefits of blue and green space in cities. I just wrote to some journalists recently, actually making that very point, that the message is not really getting out, particularly around blue space and access and the need for improved water quality, because children will touch it, they will possibly even drink it. And there's also a bit of a neurosis about providing access to water for children. And so we need to think very carefully about both water quality, but also what kind of access and safe access. And these are some of the things in terms of safe access that are one of the major barriers to advancing access to water in cities. But the answer to your question is really no, that there isn't at the moment a linkage, but there needs to be better linkage. And I think getting journalists on board with this idea is one way to go.
Thank you. Let's see. Can you share ideas on how to improve navigation of people with dementia in the city through any aspect of urban design? And we all know that dementia often for people begins with a moderate or a very early stage that can go on for years. And it's not unique to people with dementia, but that issue of a sense of control in the city is partly about one's ability to find one's way. Thoughts on that? What has your research taught you about basically kind of wayfinding and navigation?
It's a really big area, and you can find a lot of literature about it. It's a very well-researched area. It's probably actually one of the first areas that I found myself in when I got interested in this topic area. And I mean, I could list a million things, but some of the ones that pop into my mind, people with dementia who have been living for a long time in a particular place really struggle with change to that environment, in particular change to landscapes, change to landmarks, change to, they know to turn left at the post box. If the post box is no longer there, then that causes, a disproportionate amount of problems if you're a person with dementia. If you know to turn left at the greengrocer, and the greengrocer has carrots out on the sidewalk in the way that Jenny described as being, quite a fine-grained permeable sort of a storefront. You can see what's inside it from what's outside it. Then they know that that's where to turn left. But if that store then turns into more of a glass block building that are like, concrete, that you can't really quite tell that, the cues are gone. And I think that really I've been struck by the importance of landmarks and how to deal with that when they change. There's a lot around what is helpful types of lettering, having signs perpendicular rather than parallel to walls, not having an excessive amount of street furniture to cause confusion. There are a really large number of navigational challenges, but keeping it simple and keeping it legible seem to be incredibly important. You can definitely look a lot into this, and in the sort of aging city literature, there's a lot of very interesting stuff. Jenny, have you got any favorites?
I think just legibility and coherence, two words that you just mentioned. I think it's also not just about physical attributes, it's about the sort of social infrastructure. So in the book, we have a case study from York. York is in the UK. And they have a policy for the dementia-friendly city, which includes trying to foster legibility, coherence in street design and keeping things simple. But it's also about having friendly signage on shops where you can expect a shopkeeper, to be helpful in terms of interacting with you. It's about having specific places where people with dementia can feel welcomed and can go. And it's also about having, particularly again for older people, seating and access to bathroom facilities. So it's part of a whole package that needs to be thought about.
Jenny, that brilliantly ties a bridge right to one of our family members at IHCD, and that's Dr. Nat Hosono in Tokyo, who, of course, my Japanese colleague wants to know about public toilets. So how would you think the public toilet function in modern times? Many people use it as a private room recently to find on their smartphones where there's a place. One of the things I've learned from my Japanese colleagues who have very impressive sophistication about the role of toilets in society is that it is a place that we sometimes need, particularly in dense urban places like Japan has, a place to restore ourselves. So talk to us about what research you might have had some role in looking at the role of public toilets. I'm very much reminded of Vesper talking about hostile architecture. The lack of public toilets is hostile architecture. And we all have our favorite places that we don't go to because there is no available public toilet anywhere we can find. So please share with us your experience of toilets for our Japanese colleagues, but for everyone else.
I mean, we definitely have a part in the book that does talk about toilets. And I think that we sort of frame it in the context of quite often cities being designed with the sort of working age, able-bodied male in mind. And that actually lots of the people who are more likely to need toilets are people from all the other categories of full diversities of people who are using the cities, whether it's, you know, parents with or carers with children, whether it's people with various types of disabilities, whether it's older people, whether it, you know, women with various with issues with periods, with all these things that have been poorly thought about in terms of inclusion. Now, certainly we do look at that in the book from that context, but in terms of specific toilet research, I'm not exactly sure. So I'm going to pass to Jenny and see whether you have anything.
And we'd be happy to share our large collection of toilet
That would be wonderful.
Jenny, anything to add there?
So not much to add other than I think it could be a restorative experience, but it isn't currently. I know a few very restorative bathrooms in the world, but there are very few and far between. So yeah, an area where there needs to be a lot more work done.
Well, we, my friend Nat in Tokyo and I would love to take you to a phenomenal public restroom just inside one of the largest subway stations in central Tokyo, which is actually a place that one can actually restore oneself. Take a few minutes and pause. Vesper or Hannah, anything on this issue of the role of public toilets?
I can say this, you know, to quote a few disability rights activists, I'm tired of being grateful for an accessible toilet, right? It's something that I hear a lot. So accessible toilets are an important piece, meaning like whether or not it has a handle so you can get up. What's the weight limit on that handle? You know, what is the size in terms of area for the person sitting and using the toilet? I spend a lot of time in New York City, mainly because my partner is studying at Columbia, and there's this great network called Got to Go NYC, which tells you where the family bathrooms are, what bathrooms are where, you know, just because within the midst of the chaos of being in the city, trying to find a bathroom can be challenging, especially if you're a trans person as well. You might often be using family bathrooms, you might often be using other spaces. And as well as like, it's good to know geographically where something is in case of your disability. It's just, it's good to be informed ahead of time. So I think that that's an important piece as well in terms of cities and placement of bathrooms.
Thank you. Hannah, anything? Hannah has also the challenge of finding them as a person with low vision, and that is often a confounding aspect of urban navigation. Hannah?
Yes. That is absolutely correct. I never am able to find a bathroom. And so I have developed a bladder of steel as a result. But one of the things that I think that has also been mentioned by colleagues of mine who are blind and visually impaired is also that because of the lack of public toilets, I think there's also a lack of standardization of bathrooms, which makes it very difficult for people with all sorts of disabilities, including sensory brain-based and physical disabilities, to understand the layout of the bathroom. Where's the trash can? Where are the towels? Are there towels? Where, you know, which side of the door opens? What's going on? I think can be extremely disorienting. And I think the benefit also of having an increased number of public restrooms is potentially an increased standardization of the layout of restrooms and of what people can expect when going to the restroom.
And I'm glad that you've mentioned the issue of apps to direct us to public toilets. There are a number of them. It's not just New York City. We can share those as a follow-on with everyone. We have an interesting question here that I think is a critically important one. COVID-initiated remote working, thank you to Ren, a guest who has put this in, COVID-initiated remote working and movement to more affordable locations have decimated many downtowns. How might those cities leverage their relative emptiness to make this once-in-a-generation change that you suggest? Never waste a crisis.
That sounds like the sort of question Jenny likes to answer.
So I think we are wasting the opportunity that COVID presented to us at the moment to build back better and revitalize those downtowns. I was in Charlottesville on Saturday morning at 10:45 and it was empty. I went to get a coffee. I was stunned how empty it was. And my students are working on a revitalization project and they have to think about the COVID impact this semester. I think we have to rethink what our city downtowns are for, and that they're not necessarily about retail and shopping, which is what they've been traditionally and historically earmarked for, but they are more opportunities for recreation and to come together and to see people and not necessarily have to spend money in. So I do think it's a problem, and I don't think we can solve it from one disciplinary perspective. I think it's one of those wicked city problems we need to think about from a systems perspective and get very many views on. So I'd love to hear from people in this forum what they think needs to happen. I think we need to radically rethink what our downtown is and who it's for.
Other points on that, Layla, Hannah, Vesper. I mean, I think we feel a sense of urgency as an organization about this once in a generation, maybe once in multiple generations, having an opportunity to think fundamentally differently about anything that we have before us. And this certainly is one of the most compelling. I mean, here in Boston, where we're based, it's an enormous issue. And we've been looking a bit at places around the world, Mexico City being one of them, where physical activities outside Mexico City feels like a place where dancing together in public appears to be rather popular and incredibly exciting, even just to be standing on the sidelines, watching people of all ages and from all kinds of communities dancing together on the street. So I think this is a moment when we have to think about what might be possible. So any thoughts on that from either Hannah or Vesper?
My initial thoughts are, I think one of the benefits of kind of downtown areas of cities are that they have infrastructure for a lot of people. I think that could be extremely beneficial in thinking about, Jenny and Layla sort of talking about interaction with other people, and Valerie, how you had mentioned of people kind of coming together to be doing sort of communal activities. I think it's, again, echoing Jenny's sentiment about how do we rethink the activities that we do in these areas, and how do we utilize this infrastructure in a way that could not only, thinks about economic welfare or kind of financial gains, but rather thinking about what can a number of people in a concentrated area do, and how can that create community, and what does that look like?
Yeah, I think that intentional centering of social space is a big part of it. I think in terms of like urban optimization, there's sometimes a lot of space that isn't used for whatever reason. And I mean, it's, for example, with parking lotscapes, could you have green areas at the top of those parking lots, or rather parking garages, or around them? And I think it's that consideration as well. Like, how are we using the space and when? We are in what I like to call a dopamine pursuit society. And people are turning online, they're turning through many different resources to do that. And I think by having environments that encourage social interaction in safe and considerate ways, we can really increase that social connection. So how do we optimize urban space is another thing that comes to mind for me.
And I think it's another reminder, Vesper, that part of what we want to do is tell more stories about places that are doing interesting things, and share that as a set of global information. And I think Layla and Jenny have been extremely generous in Restorative Cities in bringing a lot of those stories forward. There's a lot more to share, and I think we need to really understand the good stories that enliven people's sense of opportunities for creativity. I am delighted to say that we have an architect who is a colleague of ours from Lagos, Nigeria, and he is just wondering where to get the book. It is, of course, available through that online ordering mecca. Two of them, or anywhere. You can really get this on Amazon. You can get it as a Kindle. You can get it in paperback. You can get it in hard copy. It is very available. If our authors would really like to recommend any particular source, please do.
Yeah, if you're having any trouble getting it, then go directly to the publishers. I put the link in there. There've been some people in various countries where it's been tricky to find, and the publishers tend to be helpful in coming up with a way or telling you the one bookstore in your country that may have it. So yeah, people all over the world have been buying this book. It's been really cool to see people reading it in all these different cities. And yeah, essentially you can order it from most bookstores.
Wonderful. And this is an architect early in his career, zealous about inclusive design. So very important book for him to have. One of the things that another guest has asked, Janet Jimenez, does the book include road safety issues, an aspect of pedestrian crossing points where not only physical and sensory access should be considered, but going beyond that and really thinking about this cognitive or mental health issues? And we deal a lot with public rights of way, and it is often, a frustration to everyone that people feel unsafe and out of control in that public realm of that tension between automobiles and sometimes bicycles and scooters and pedestrians. And what's your thinking about that? We're doing a lot of work on this right now. What are you working on relative to evidence-based answers in terms of what do we need to do to make environments where all those things can happen, that multimodal world works without putting people in a sense of risk or jeopardy?
Well, I can perhaps kick off here because I'm working with a transportation planner on really a new model of streets, which we're calling restorative streets, which is about the experience of getting from A to B and its effect on your mental health. So transportation planning typically approaches getting from A to B in terms of efficiency, getting there the quickest, the fastest, most direct way possible. But we are arguing, Andrew Monchon and I, that there's much more than that. And so transportation really needs to rethink. Safety is obviously a huge aspect. What's really interesting, and this is anecdotal, but there have been experiments both in London and in the Netherlands and Europe where they have taken away all the signage, all the stop signs, all the traffic lights, and they let the public kind of fathom their way through an area. And what happens is the bikes slow down, the cars stop, the pedestrians cross the road safely. And they've shown that those types of experiments actually do reduce accidents. And I forget what the term is called to describe these kind of unserviced, really unlabeled kind of environments, but they are incredibly effective. I do think we're making progress on what we call multimodal streets around the world. I think there's, we need to go much further in terms of thinking about how that works for mental health and social well-being.
We would applaud that, and we certainly are advocates of complete streets, but we also know that people routinely do not anticipate the ordinary diversity of who is out there. So that the idea that somebody doesn't hear you shout, that somebody doesn't see you coming, is something that is quite foreign to a lot of people, and it's going to take a lot of muscle building to really anticipate human diversity of physical, sensory, and brain-based issues. Because right now, a lot of people don't feel safe on the street, and that's a big challenge right now. We have a question here for Layla from Reggie Ramos, who is our Director of Transportation. And you were in a fellowship together in Hong Kong. And she's saying, what really stood out for me in the book is your mention of the inaccurate belief that people of racial or ethnic minorities self-segregate into ethnic enclaves or ethno-burbs. On the other end are immigrants moving into mixed neighborhoods as they move up in economic status. For first-generation immigrants in the US, for example, the Gen Xers and millennials who now have the financial capability to move out, but are torn by cultural expectation, such as taking care of aging parents, for example, and translating into being stranded in the neighborhoods they grew up in. At the same time, they are aware of the benefits of raising their children in diverse neighborhoods. How do you navigate through this in terms of spatially locating themselves and maintaining around mental health? This question is made more poignant in light of what happened in Monterey Park this weekend. Trust you know about the mass shooting in the Los Angeles area. You're on mute.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one, isn't it? In the book, we have some interesting examples of how some cities, particularly in Europe, have dealt with this as a challenge. And that's really thinking about how you can have neighborhoods that work well through the lifespan and for people who have various diverse needs. You know, things like, for example, a housing development that has homes that work for solo people, for families, for people with perhaps three or four generations living within them, and being able to reconfigure homes to enable that to happen really means that you can get that diversity in. One of the things that I was quite struck by when we were researching this book was the real benefits of having people who are committed to a neighborhood over a certain period of time. We see that with these transitory neighborhoods that people might be in, they might be hoping to get out as quick as possible. They are less likely to invest in the development and upkeep and improvement of that neighborhood. And when you can design a neighborhood that is appealing across different generations, then that has real benefits for the neighborhood and everybody who lives in it. The challenge is understanding the differences in needs across these different people and making it appropriate and desirable for them to be there, rather than somewhere that they're trying to escape from, is the first thing that comes to mind. And again, it's about thinking about what does inclusion mean in these different contexts. Another example that's in the book of non-inclusion is in mixed income housing, where there exists a thing called poor doors, where people who are being subsidized and affordable housing will enter through one part of the door, and people who own the homes may enter through another part and have access to, for example, a better parts of the garden. And that's the sort of thing that can really breed exclusion and resentment and low self-esteem that can be linked to mental health problems. So I'm veering around a few different areas there, but those are some of the things that come to mind that are worth considering. Jenny, do you have anything to add to that? Said it all.
Just a note, we've had the opportunity to work with Singapore, and you may know that in the estate housing of Singapore, which houses 85% of the population, and that's a limited equity model. Everybody owns their condo, but they are capped in equity so that you don't end up with wildly expensive units when they turn over. But one of the things that has been characteristic of their commitment is, one thing is shared spaces out of doors with a real intentional habit of really thinking about children, adults, and older people in the outdoor spaces as it relates to play. And the other thing that they've done quite cleverly is to really create within every estate units that are designed specifically for older people, so that people who may have raised their families in those developments have a place to go when they no longer need the apartment that they may have raised their families in. And those apartments have features that work for an older individual or a couple. It's just a model that makes so much sense, but of course in a very planful culture. Hannah, anything else on that issue of Hannah grew up in the Bay Area, and I think San Francisco is a place that has both succeeded and failed brilliantly in their ability to sustain a commitment to diversity. Hannah. Yes,
especially as an Asian American woman, I think this question is extremely poignant to me, especially in the aftermath of Monterey Park. I think one of the things that really resonates me is this idea of cultural pressure, especially to be taking care of aging parents. And I think Valerie touched on this really well, is the idea of multi-generational housing. I think is an incredibly key part of creating sustaining neighborhoods. And in regards to the diversity in San Francisco, especially in regards to the recent years of mass gentrification and mass exodus, especially as a result of large tech giants moving in and then subsequently moving out for COVID. I think it has done quite irreparable damage to the city. I feel like it has driven out a lot of kind of smaller, what you might consider like mom and pop shops in the city, and I think I would just echo that San Francisco is facing this crisis about how do you maintain, sort of an identity, a cultural identity of a city when there is so much transience, when there isn't necessarily a commitment to the development or to the care and to the maintenance of the places that we live. And it's incredibly distressing for people like me who grew up in the city, and it's something that we are definitely navigating right now.
Okay. I think this issue of the rich pockets of cultural identity that we know is something you find almost only in cities, is something that we all treasure, whether we travel in places like the United States or England. It is part of the joy of experiencing new places, is to have that immersion into other cultures. But it is a tension that is tough to figure out. And I think it's one of the things that it is both one of the most exciting and healthy aspects of cities, and one of the most difficult to sustain in a way that makes sense, and that doesn't end up driven entirely by economics, which is one of the things that is a maddening reality of projects that we work on, is that economics drives everything. The quest for affordable housing, the quest to solve the problem of the unhoused, and how to do that in a way that seeks balance. And I think one of the things that Restorative Cities is pushing us to get to is a respect for balance of all of these things. Is that fair to say, that balance is a piece of the dynamic of getting to where you are advising we need to go?
Jenny and I wait to see who is going to be saying that. Yeah, I mean, I think that is something that does resonate for me. We're thinking about cities, there's just so many different people, different types of people in cities with so many different needs. And really the massive task of the good urban designer, of the good planner, is to find a way to enable all of those people to find aspects that work for them, to find accessibility that makes sense for them, to find, as Jenny said, the type of fascination that works for them, regardless of what their particular needs and perceptions might be. A city is all about balance, and you're right that getting it right is potentially a step in that direction towards achieving a restorative city.
Jenny?
I might use a slightly different word. I might use, the aim is equilibrium, or, an equity in that. I think my kind of intuitive response is we do need to advantage certain people, I think. And I think there's a really interesting movement in Vancouver, Canada, 8 to 80 cities. And the idea is that if you create a city for a child or an older person with cognitive and physical issues, then we all benefit and we all gain. So I'm slightly veering towards, yes, we need balance and equilibrium, but I think there are certain demographic groups that if we concentrate and focus on, that we will all benefit.
So I need to pick up on that one, because we are convinced that designing to the edges is a way to design better for everyone. That anticipating that the edges of ability, age, and culture and economic status are really critical elements, and that, again, it's the building of muscles that in order to do good design, we need to anticipate the ordinary diversity of who we design for. And to recognize that this non-apparent set of reasons for functional limitation, that brain-based set of issues, is an enormous reality in the 21st century all over the world. And we need to get much better at anticipating it, even though people have a habit of assuming I could spot someone with a disability, which is just absurd in today's world. That is not true. So I think that's important. There is one thing we haven't talked about at all. Then one of our questioners actually asked about this, and thinking about culture. So we could categorize that under play. Where do you categorize cultural engagement in terms of, oh my goodness, what do we have there? A pup. Oh, an adorable pup. One of the really critical aspects of restoration, pets. But culture, we do a great deal of work in the cultural sector, and we believe deeply that it is one of the very best places that we connect, and ideally with the cultural institutions among the leaders, at least here in the United States, of really driving a very big agenda of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, that culture is indeed a point of connection and intersection. Tell us about your thinking on that, and evidence. It's, you're so generous in sharing the evidence on that. What have you got on culture?
On evidence, I think it's a bit thin in relation to mental health and social well-being. I think that what our approach in the book is that at both a neighborhood and city scale, cultural facilities need to be integrated within the fabric of our everyday. They need to be easily accessible. We talk about the 20-minute city in the book, the idea that everything is within access by public transit or walking or cycling within 20 minutes. Scotland, where both Leila and I are from, has a wonderful model and is really advancing this idea of the 20-minute city. And that has to include everything, the whole 9 yards, including culture, including education, including work, including shops, so it's maybe some people think it's too ideal a model, but certainly there are countries, Scotland being one, who are trying to make that happen. So I do think access to culture is a critical restorative attribute. There's a little bit of evidence around access to art galleries and how they can be good for restorative health, but there's it's poor. The research is poor in that area.
There's some interesting work coming out of, funded by the Arts Council in Wales actually at the moment, looking at health and access to arts, and it's coming up with some interesting ideas. I think that this is an area that is ripe for further exploration. What's really interesting, I think, about restorative cities is that it is an emerging specialty. The research continues to emerge, so people who are interested in this have a fantastic opportunity to, select the part of it that is of interest to them and go off and really contribute to the field, because it is still developing and there is a ton of opportunity to make a difference. And yeah, that's just one of the many areas I think that you've lighted on where there is this opportunity to really learn more and see how can we use it.
And I will tell you, in reflection of our own deep experience every day and working with museums in particular, but also performing art spaces, that I think there is a rising awareness of mental health and wellness as critical areas to address, in the museum world, really looking at exhibits that talk about mental health and well-being. That this, I think, is what appears to be emerging as a trend. I think there's sort of a hopeful effort. Our own Museum of Science in Boston had a weekend focused on mental health. I've been fortunate to work on an advisory committee with the museum, and I think it's the beginning of a process that's going to play out for a good long time. And I think people like Hannah and Vesper need to be more involved in what does that mean. It's not reverting to just services or the phenomenon of neuroscience, but to really think about people with lived experience of brains that work differently. So I think we are at a point where we can give everybody, let me just make sure that I haven't got, a very important guest, Beth Tauke, who is a professor of architecture at Buffalo and one of the great leaders on inclusive design. How do you recommend that designers, planners, and policymakers take on the aspects of urban restoration that you mentioned? Fascination, being away and extent, compatibility, and especially wonder and curiosity. So how do you recommend that designers, planners, and policymakers take that on?
Shall I take that on, Leila, since I work in a design school and training architects and landscape architects to do that very, very
And Beth is a professor of architecture.
Yeah, delighted to meet you, Beth, remotely. How do you take it on? Well, we do argue in the book that it's not a toolbox, that we give general principles based upon evidence. Everything we suggest is evidence-based. Where it's not evidence-based, we don't commit. But it's about interpreting those guidelines flexibly, because one thing I have learned about architects, having also been married to one, is that you cannot impose rules on them. They are your creative individuals, and you need the leg room and bandwidth to interpret guidelines flexibly and creatively. I really think it boils down to who your user group is. And if you take those 4 restorative attributes and psychological processes, they're both attributes and processes of fascination, being away, extent, and compatibility, you have to really dig down deep with your user group and co-create and understand, well, what does fascination mean for this particular community? What does being away mean for this particular community? What is compatible with their needs? So that would be my recommendation to people in the design world. I think my recommendation to people in policy would be slightly different because it's a different process. And so, but in terms of architecture, that's certainly what I teach and how I guide my students. And it's quite phenomenal, the number of students who come back to me 5, 6, 7 years hence and say, Jenny, fascination, can we talk about that in the context of, people with dementia or people with autism or teenagers, or so please reach out if you would like another discussion about that in relation to a particular user group.
And I think one of the things that just build on this, and certainly Beth is very aware of this, but I think one of the unfortunate realities in the United States that has such a deep commitment to accessibility is that we've seen an unfortunate habit of thought that if I make something fully accessible based on the standards and meeting those responsibilities, I'm all set. Just tell me what I have to do has never inspired anybody. And I think it's that idea that the bigger idea, and all the people who aren't covered whatsoever in standards really are a creative opportunity, deeply creative. And I think it's communicating that sense of incentive for that opportunity that exists to really transform people's experience. So anyway, thank you, Beth, for coming in, and do follow up with Jenny. I think that's an honest invitation. So last thoughts, my friends. Let's give our people with lived experience the first opportunity, and then we'll have the authors speak. So Hannah, would you start?
Thank you, Valerie. Just want to say that I'm very appreciative to be in a virtual room with people who are doing such thoughtful work. Jenny, Layla, Vesper, Valerie, of course. I think the thing that I've sort of taken away from all of kind of the conversation that we've had today is the other word that's sometimes included in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that's belonging. I think belonging is really a key part of kind of a restorative experience, and especially of an experience of someone who has been traditionally marginalized, especially those who are disabled. I think one of the things that I always think about is that before people who were wheelchair users made curb cuts into the sidewalks by smashing them with hammers, is that no one said, is that people said that they've never seen someone with a wheelchair in the streets. And so they didn't know that people with wheelchairs wanted to be in the streets or wanted to go out. And I think that in many cases, this is still the case, and that people don't understand that people who are neurodivergent, or people who have mental health problems, or people who want to have, you know, that sort of restorative experience, want to be out and about and to experience the world in the way that everybody else does. And I think creating design for that, especially in thinking about, you know, consulting user groups, as Jenny had mentioned, and thinking about what that looks like is all encompassed by this idea of restorative cities, is this idea of belonging, and that we all, you know, sort of belong to this community. And I think that's a really powerful idea. So thank you.
Very nicely put. Vesper.
Yes, I mean, I think a common theme that we've been talking about is centering people with life experience. I like to say centering people with life experience in the inception, the design, the creation, and the implementation is a very, very important piece, just on a policy level, on every level. I think community gardens are so crucial for neighborhoods of lower income housing, community greenhouses where vegetables and fruits of common cultures can be grown. You know, having community libraries where a person can drop off a book and a person can pick up a book, having community instruments and pianos and things that can enrich culture and have a way of celebrating, and having recreation in the space is crucial as well. These are, I mean, when we're talking about access and accessibility in terms of mental health, this is a way of saying that the community cares about each other, that there's a focus here that we can work together. And this is when we think about beyond accessibility, beyond the, you know, fixing the cracked sidewalk, but rather we value your time and we value how we spend that time together.
Thank you, Vesper. Jenny, Layla, last thoughts.
Okay, I think that a restorative city is a resilient city, and across the world, that is what people are working so hard to achieve. There's a huge need for resilience at the moment, and this is a real opportunity to invest. We have such a mental health burden across the world, and it feels like in some ways a moral imperative to go forth and use the tools that we have in whatever the toolbox each of us has to really make an impact on that and help people where they can. But it's not just a moral argument, it's also an every type of value argument. And I think if we can get people really invested in this area, it's going to benefit people, it's going to benefit cities, it's going to benefit city leaders. It is a win-win situation, and I think that at this moment it's about raising awareness of the opportunities.
Thank you, Leila. Jenny.
Oh, well, firstly, just to thank both Hannah and Vesper for their perspectives. Really, really interesting and super important, and also Valerie for hosting. To echo what Leila said, I think there's a moral imperative to move forward on this. We are both united in that mission, and there's more work to be done. But also just on belonging, I feel we've come together today and we are a community of like-minded people who think along the similar, maybe different depending on our discipline, but similar lines. And so to really use that force for us all to just spark that light and keep the discussion going after today is super important.
Couldn't have ended on a better note. Thank you so much to Leila and Jenny, and to Vesper and Hannah, and to our audience, our wonderfully diverse audience. We deeply appreciate your time today and hope you all are a bit changed in how you are this afternoon from how you were before we started. All be well. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.